That's correct. That's correct. The dual mandate, I think, has been disastrous.
Okay.
It's like the equivalent of trying to hit, imagine playing a game of darts and you're trying to hit two targets with one arrow.
Hi, I'm Michael Graham with New Hampshire Journal. Welcome to Diner Table Economics at the iconic Airport Diner in Manchester. Vivek Ramaswamy, welcome to the Airport Diner in Manchester. Glad to have you.
It's good to be here. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's all about the economy, and I've been very frustrated, like a lot of people, in the debate stage, a minute and a half. You can say, I want to stop inflation, but you don't get really to talk about how. So we're going to talk about a lot of economic issues. And so let's start with that one, because all of you people running for president, inflation, 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 worst problem. It's in the polls again this weekend. Number one issue. What could a President Ramaswamy actually do to impact real lives on inflation?
You have to increase the supply of everything. Okay, so let's go one by one. Okay. Energy. Increase the supply of energy in the United States of America. You want to know how to do that? Drill, frack, burn coal, embrace nuclear energy. Right. It's not that complicated. And how do we do that? The good news is the restrictions on a lot of this aren't coming from Congress. They're coming from actually the administrative state, the Department of Interior, the EPA, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That reports into the President of the United States. So if you have a president who understands that, roll back a lot of those regulations, that increases the supply of energy, that brings down costs, that grows the economy. Now, inflation isn't just driven by just the energy costs, but what's downstream of those energy costs, right? So that not only brings down energy costs, it brings down costs of everything in the supply chain. Now fill in the blank with something else different than energy. Housing. Okay. Increase the supply of housing.
Now,
how do you do that?
What can the federal government do about that?
Well, I think that there's some combination of federal and state here. Okay, so we have a lot of EPA restrictions coming on from on high that have played to, constrict the construction of new houses with new home builders. But a lot of this is at the state and local level, which I support states doing, is roll back the land use restrictions. There are all kinds of land use restrictions that say, okay, the plot has to be this large, that have constricted the supply of smaller single-family housing. Change that increases the supply of housing, brings down the cost, and increases the economic growth. You could say even here, probably this diner that we're in right now, the number one thing that they would have difficulty with is hiring people to fill open positions. Well, stop using our taxpayer money to pay people more to stay at home instead of to go to work. That increases the supply of labor, brings down cost, and that's a contributor to inflation as well. So that gives you a good sense.
So you've given me a lot of things to work with here. Let's talk about the labor thing, because I've read different takes on your take on labor supply and immigration. Okay. Obviously, you've got two issues that are linked, but they're not the same. One is no actual control of the border, having 12,000 people in a single day come across. Then you have the other issue, which is how much immigration should there be and what's the proper process? So where does immigration fit in your economic, setting aside the national security issue, where does it fit in your economic plans?
So it's a good question. I think that we have to go in order here. Let's first draw the distinction between illegal mass migration versus legal immigration to this country. Sometimes both parties conflate the two. I think that's a mistake. Illegal immigration, zero tolerance policy. Build the wall at the southern border, build the wall at the northern border, use our own military to secure both borders. That's something that I think the president has authority to do, and detailed plans I've offered for how to end that. Part of this is an economic question too, though, is we need to end the incentives to be here illegally. End birthright citizenship for the kids of illegal migrants, and then also stop funding federal sanctuary cities. Now let's talk about legal.
Well, first on birthright citizenship for people who don't know.
Because
sadly, there's so little mainstream media coverage of this issue, and America's a weird place in the world as a birthright citizenship country. Just real quickly, what does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the beautiful thing about when birthright citizenship first was a concept in this country, it says that your national identity isn't based on your genetic stock or anything else. It's based on if you're born here. Now that concept, though, only applies to the kids of people who are here legally. And if you read the 14th Amendment carefully, it's clear about that. It says subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That's what that means. And so if you're the kid of anyone who's in this country here legally and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, then you enjoy birthright citizenship. But that doesn't apply to the kids of illegal migrants. And once we're clear about that, once the next president who swears an oath to the Constitution is clear about that, people don't have an incentive to illegally enter this country just for the purpose of having a baby. And then also end the federal funding for sanctuary cities, using our taxpayer money to fund the breakage of the rule of law. That doesn't make sense either.
So that's great on immigration. What about the economy, though?
Yes.
How does that fit in there?
So that's as it pertains to.
Oh, perfect.
So sorry to
This is
interrupt.
Hey,
Michael.
how you doing?
Oh, did we get a hat? We
Nice
got
to
a
meet you.
hat.
It's good to see you,
Yeah,
man.
Vivek, right?
Yeah, it's Vivek. Yeah, good to meet you, Michael.
Likewise.
I love
What
being here
would
already.
you like?
Yeah.
You know, I'll take a. You have a tea of some kind?
Certainly. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you have?
A whole basket. I bring Earl Grey, English breakfast, orange pico. I bring a little.
I'll take
basket.
an English breakfast tea.
Certainly.
Make it two.
Make it two.
Okay.
I love coffee. Doesn't
right
like
on the
me.
end of the table.
No, we're good. We're
You're
just
good?
we got chat
Okay.
first.
I understand.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Of course, I will make sure you get your hat. We'll have the hat. They'll leave
That's
the hat.
good. That's good. I like that. I like
Okay,
that.
so tell
We'll
me
save that for the end.
exactly. So tell me how immigration and the economy overlap from the labor supply side.
Yes. So one thing is we need to focus on activating our own labor supply who's already in this country. And we're paying many people, many young Americans are still relying on financial support from their parents. But the government, in the name of providing aid, we saw this during the coronavirus pandemic and otherwise, is using aid as a substitute for people actually going to work. That's not just bad for the economy, constricting the labor supply. It's even bad for mental health. I mean, people lose their sense of purpose
Sure.
and identity when they're not going to work.
Right.
And so I think it's no accident you've also seen that uptick in the mental health epidemic in this country too. That being said, the purpose of legal immigration is also to ask the question of what helps American citizens here in the homeland? And is there a role for legal immigration that helps those who live here already? Yes, there is. I want to see us operate and think like a championship team.
Okay.
Right? If you're a championship team, you're recruiting the best in every role to your own team. And if you're missing that role, you go outside to recruit it. That's the way I look at what our legal immigration policy should look like. And merit-based immigration doesn't mean a bunch of IT guys in Silicon Valley, which is how it's been mistaken.
Sure.
I think it means people who are filling.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank you
much.
very much.
Sugars on the end, on your if you need it.
Appreciate it, man.
Likewise.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In
So you're saying that merit-based immigration doesn't just mean the IT.
It
Silicon
shouldn't.
Valley,
It
or
shouldn't just
should,
mean
okay.
that. That's what it's historically been applied to mean.
Right.
But I think if you look at like all of the shortages that we have in this country, and even many people will say, well, we can't secure the border because we need those illegal mass migrants.
Right.
Well, we shouldn't have a system that relies on breaking the rule of law.
Right.
If it's really true that the U.S. needs that, first let's look to our own domestic existing labor supply of people who aren't going to work. But then if we really need to supplement that, great. That's what the legal immigration system is for. But I do think that the sole purpose of the legal immigration system, and I think it's important to be clear on this, should be what immigration policy advances the interests
Right.
of the Americans who are already here. That's a question that we need to be clear about.
Sure.
That means that asylum, bring down a lot of the asylum.
Right.
Chain migration, of even people bringing family members, that's not merit. And so the sole purpose of our immigration policy should be what advances the Americans' interests who are already here.
But what do you say?
But
to
there's
people,
a role for that.
What do you say to
absolutely.
people who say, "Yeah, I know, I see what you're going to do. As soon as my labor gets up to a point where it's really paying me a sweet deal, you're going to allow merit immigration to bring people in and drive my wages down."
I don't want that.
Oh, okay.
I don't want that. Absolutely. This should not be uncapped in its nature. This should be literally where there is no other option,
Right.
but then to get it out from the outside. That's my answer to the people who say, I'm a hard liner. I'm probably
Right.
the hardest liner on not only ending illegal immigration, but mass deportation of anybody who's in this country illegally.
Right.
I am unshakable in my conviction on that. So in response to the people who say, no, that needs,
Right.
we don't have enough of that labor force and supply here. First of all, I'm skeptical of that. Many of the people in the United States, we need to incentivize to go back to work. But if there really is that gap, that's the role that the legal immigration system plays. But we got to have that championship team mentality.
Well, we know championship team mentality in New England. We just hired Bill Belichick and
I
Tom,
know.
and Tom Brady. It solves all our problems. Let's go back up to the top end of the economy, which is the Fed and inflation.
Yes.
So I noticed you talked about specific policies that would increase supply, make supply more available, so you have more stuff for those dollars to chase. But the fact
Yes.
is, the dollars are pouring out of the Fed. What's the Ramaswamy president's view of the Fed and its role in the economy overall and inflation in particular?
Yes. So my view is the Fed has far overstepped its bounds. The role of the U.S. Federal Reserve should be to stabilize the U.S. dollar as a unit of measurement, period. That's it.
Not achieve an unemployment rate of a specific target or an inflation rate of 2%, for example?
That's
not there?
correct. That's
Not
correct.
that.
The dual mandate, I think, has been disastrous. It's
Okay.
like the equivalent of trying to hit Imagine playing a game of darts and you're trying to hit two targets with one arrow. It doesn't work, right? You want to hit one target. Dollar stability. And I think that's part of why you haven't seen real wage growth in the last 25 years. Inflation adjusted for the bottom 99%, certainly, real wage growth has remained approximately flat.
Right.
And part of the reason is you have a U.S. Federal Reserve that views wage growth as something that's bad because they treat it as a leading indicator of inflation. So normally I wouldn't go into this depth, but we're having an economic discussion here. So let me just go a layer deeper. So you have a Fed, since the academics took over in 1997, that has viewed wage growth as a leading indicator of inflation. Right. First of all, anybody who knows anything about the business cycle, or anybody who's run a business, and I have run multiple businesses, knows that wages are the last thing to go up in the business cycle. So you have a Fed that has consistently tightened monetary policy into what would have naturally been a downturn of the business cycle.
Right.
Instead of smoothing the business cycle, which is what they've claimed to do, has given us boom-bust bailout cycles. We saw that in 2000. We saw that in 2008. We saw some measure of that earlier this year. And so I think that that's a mistaken policy. I also think the dual mandate is based on a false premise. It's known as the Phillips curve.
Right.
You may be familiar with that. It says that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. That was based on outdated British data from another era in New Zealand.
But even if it worked, we've seen in the recent history, it's just not true.
It just doesn't work.
It doesn't work anymore.
No, but and you're correct about that. But that's a kind interpretation.
No,
it hasn't worked for 25 years. Is what I would say. Since 2000, I think it hasn't worked.
So what has changed? Do you think this is where technology and the economy cross over?
Yes, exactly. It's not the old 1900s, 20th century British data from New Zealand. It's a different economy today. And so we need to wake up and catch up to the times. And look, I'm a leader from a different generation who can help get us there. I understand. This is second nature for me. And so go back to dollar stability. When the dollar was stable before we went off the gold standard, GDP growth was over 4% on average in this country. That makes sense. When the dollar's volatile, capital is inefficiently allocated. Stabilize the dollar, you have more efficient capital allocation. That's how you deliver economic growth. I think it takes a CEO in the White House, somebody who understands this, somebody who has lived the full arc of the American dream that wants to pass that on to the next generation. And putting the Fed back in its place is certainly a big part of that for me. And I'll give you one more dirty little tactic here, which I think is going to be helpful. Part of the problem at the Fed is you had a proliferation of the headcount. 23,000 employees at the U.S. Fed.
Right.
When you have a bunch of people showing up to work who should have never had that job in the first place, they start finding things to do.
Exactly.
Phillips curve, the CBDC, the central bank digital currency they're now turning to, which I think is a threat to liberty. We don't need that. And I think that that's part of what we're going to have to revive in this country.
This episode of Dining Table Economics is brought to you by the Competitiveness Coalition, a first-of-its-kind group that champions pro-consumer policies to foster innovation and create growth. Chaired by New Hampshire resident and former Ambassador Scott Brown and featuring Drew Klein of the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy, the Competitiveness Coalition is pushing back against the excessive overreach of the Biden administration, especially Federal Trade Commission Chair Lena Khan. The coalition believes that politicians and unelected bureaucrats should not punish entrepreneurs or discourage future innovation with unfair regulations or discriminatory taxes. After all, breaking up a successful American business only helps China and our other foreign competitors. The Competitiveness Coalition is a natural fit with the Live Free or Die state, and we are happy to have their support. Please find out more at competitivenesscoalition.com.
Okay, so I'm going to do my favorite part while you get your tea ready there and say,
oh, thank you.
Thanks.
Wow, getting food. Oh my gosh, appreciate that.
Too.
Thank
You're
you.
living large. Excellent.
Thank you.
Food here is great.
Thank you. I'm excited to try it.
We're going to
May I eat while we chat?
Please do. We're going to talk in just a few seconds about food too.
Good.
Cover that. So you're crazy. And the reason you're crazy is I read that you're planning to have more than 5% growth, greater than 5% growth in the United States. The United States is a mature economy. You do not do, you can do it for a quarter here, a quarter there, but you cannot do 5% growth for a developed economy. I mean, you just can't do it.
If productivity remains flat, you're right about that. I don't think productivity has to remain flat.
And what's going to turn that around?
Technology.
AI, is this an AI thing?
Well, I think AI can play a role in that.
One of the things I definitely want to ask you too about, and we can chat and then we can edit as this was great, because I do want to follow up on the 5% growth thing. But what did you learn going from a guy with a normal income as a kid to a crazy? And you have crazy income, obviously, compared to most of us. What did you learn that can actually apply to being president from that experience? See what I'm saying?
Yeah,
From
I
going
think a
from,
lot.
You know, because you were a guy in a normal family, you know, count the bills, blah, blah, blah. Now you're in
Absolutely.
a position where you're not in that spot anymore.
And
How
we
does
went
that
through-
impact you being president?
I think it impacts me in a few ways. I think one is it shows me that anything's possible in this country. And I think that that's the true American dream. My dad faced layoffs at GE when we were growing up, and that was a real shock to our family. I mean, Jack Welch was in charge.
Right.
2/3 of the people at his plant were fired,
Wow.
or planned to be fired. And I watched what my dad did, actually. He ended up keeping his job, but by working triply hard. I'm not even going to say doubly hard. Triply hard is he went to law school at night. GE paid for it because they had a shortage of patent attorneys.
Wow.
He figured out that was a place where he could have job
Right.
stability and did it. And I was in 6th grade, 7th grade. I would go to law school with him at night
Wow.
and sit in the back of the class. And so that had an impact on me.
Right.
Say, this is how you do it. You work hard, you get ahead. And then,
Right.
you know, in my own adult career, that's how I got ahead as well.
Sure.
My parents had an expression, good luck, they would say, but luck is spelled W-O-R-K, right? And so that did have an impact on me. And I want every kid, so it's a sense of gratitude. One of the ways it would impact me as president is,
Right.
it does impact me even now in this journey, is I'm moved by a sense of gratitude to this country.
Right.
I mean, the country that allows us to live that dream.
Right.
Kid of immigrants who came to this country with no money, who went through some economic,
Sure.
at least challenges growing up. In a middle-class family, akin
Sure.
to what so many families go through at some point in their life as a family. To be able to found multiple multi-billion-dollar companies
Right.
and self-finance a presidential campaign at the age of 38,
Right.
only in this country,
Right.
the United States of America. So that gratitude is, I think, something that will guide me.
So you mentioned GE and your dad. This is perfect because my dad worked for GE as a TV repairman.
Is that right?
And he eventually opened his own shop, and then the 1990s came, and then Chinese products flooded the market, and his entire industry disappeared. I mean, when was the last time we saw a TV show? No one gets TVs
Totally.
repaired anymore. And it's affected me when I hear people saying, I need special protection for my corner of the economy.
Yeah, we'll keep it here. Yeah, thank you. Yep,
By
thank
the way,
you.
what did you order?
I don't know whatever they got for me. It looks
What
like a
was
veggie
it?
burger.
This is a veggie burger.
Yeah, thank
A
you.
veggie
Okay,
burger?
thank you. Yeah.
Veggie burger?
Sauteed veggies, avocado.
Healthy.
coleslaw.
You lost my vote,
Yeah,
man. I'm
why is it?
sorry. Meat.
I'm heavy. Oh, okay.
Meat.
Yeah.
Meat. You gotta eat meat.
I'm actually a vegetarian.
Oh,
that's
I'm
where the big
so
muscles
sorry
come
to,
from.
I'm so sorry to hear that. And you had such promise too.
Yeah, I
to
know,
me.
How would
No,
it be?
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk more about
Yeah,
food in a
thank you.
second. But it was interesting. You were talking about your dad and GE. My dad worked for GE, and he fixed TVs.
Yeah.
And then because of the change in trade policy,
Yeah.
the TV repair industry disappeared because the price of every product went down, which was great. But people could get a new TV for like $9.
Yeah.
The problem is, what about that sector? And a lot of sectors of the economy say when trade changes, we want protection. We want something special. And it affected me because I say, no one was there for my dad.
Yeah.
My dad's entire business that he built himself, after he left GE, went
Yep.
out of business. What is your big picture view of trade? And do you think that the job of Washington is to ameliorate the impacts of trade, or is it to simply say, how can we make the economy the most efficient for the most people?
So there's a couple dimensions here, because some of this does relate to national security. So that comes top. We cannot depend on China for our modern way of life. See, and that's the big question, right? I mean, everything else is around the edges, and I'll come back to telling you where trade can play a role in this. Today, we depend on China for 95% of the pharmaceuticals in our medicine cabinet, even our own military equipment. Think about that.
Right.
The F-35 jets that we make in this country come from Communist China. I mean, the parts do.
Right, sure.
And so that's unconscionable. We can't depend on an adversary or enemy for our modern way of life. That was never the case for the USSR, and it shouldn't be the case for Communist China today. That's not economics. I think that's about basic security and existence of a country. Now, how are we going to be able to declare economic independence from China? It's going to be a combination of onshoring production to the United States. Some of that just happens through market mechanisms. Why are people going to China?
Right.
We have constrictions in this country, climate caps or otherwise,
Right.
that are actually forcing many businesses to choose to go to places like China. Get rid of that. Let them play by a level playing field in the United States. Many of those businesses will absolutely naturally come back to this country. But there's also a role for expanded trade to play a role here. Japan, South Korea,
Right.
Australia, India, Chile, South America. If we're really serious about declaring independence from China, and I am, it's going to take the ability to cut the cord by making sure that we're not just onshoring to the United States. That's my first best preference. But also getting really serious. I can't just wave a magic wand and make that happen. That's going to happen through expanded relationships with certain other allied countries as well.
But you know that if efficiency is the priority, then you're going to have more or less restricted trade, more free trade. And so how are you going to get to
efficiency
5%?
Is a priority.
But how do you get to 5% growth if you don't have as efficient as possible
I think
supply of goods and services in and out of the country?
Well, I think a few things here. One is the number one constriction on efficiency, let's actually get real about this, is the regulatory regime in the United States.
All right.
I think most of those federal regulations are actually unconstitutional, measured against the Supreme Court's test in West Virginia versus EPA.
Right.
Which held that delegating that authority to the EPA was unconstitutional by Congress. Well, guess what? If that's unconstitutional, most of those federal regulations are unconstitutional. Rip that regulatory wet blanket off. Put people back to work. As I said, stop using our taxpayer money to pay them more to stay at home. Combine that with dollar stability. I mean, dollar stability means pegging into a basket of commodities. Those are big levers in driving major economic growth, unleashing the supply of housing, energy, and otherwise. And then you combine that with, I would say, policies that for me in our dealings with countries like China go beyond just efficiency. It comes back to the long-run security and existence of the United States. Even the onshoring of much of that supply to the United States, I think, could have a net positive impact for the U.S. as well. So that's something that's going to happen on my watch.
So you mentioned regulation.
Yes.
The Biden administration has really kicked things up at the Federal Trade Commission with Lena Khan, FTC. So it's very much a big is inherently bad, outcomes don't matter, that's too much power in one place. Where are you on the FTC? Does it need to be pulled back in, or are you comfortable with where they are? Or?
I think it needs to be pulled back in. It's one of those three-letter agencies that is arbitrarily and capriciously picking the examples that it goes after. And I think that that's not right. I think that we have too much arbitrariness in the way these regulations are applied. And so many of these agencies, they act as judge, juror, lawmaker, rulemaker, and executioner. That's a violation of separation of powers. And so on my watch, we're going to have a 75% reduction in the number of federal bureaucrats by the end of my first term. And I want people to understand that. That's not incremental.
Sure.
That's a seismic shock to the DC bureaucracy. But that's what it's going to take to actually revive this country. And I'm confident that if I'm able to implement that, that'll have great impact on economic growth, but also in reviving our constitutional republic.
So a follow-up on that is, my wife never pays attention to all this stuff like this until she heard that they were talking about taking away Amazon Prime and breaking up Amazon again. Because once again, because apparently the size, the argument is, and I get the argument, the size is just so big.
You want to know what a better argument is?
What?
Is the government co-opting those companies to do what the government couldn't do directly. That's the real big tech problem. I don't call it big tech censorship. I call it government tech censorship.
Okay.
Right, when the government is using companies to do through the back door what government couldn't do through the front door. I think lobbying is a big part of the problem. I mean, larger companies have the ability, one of the competitive advantages they have versus smaller companies. You even see that in the industry that I used to be in, right? My first business was a biotech company. Smaller biotech companies have trouble competing with pharma because pharma has lobbying dollars that smaller biotech companies don't. Same with health insurance companies and otherwise. So I'd say focus on that. End the cronyism. End the lobbying. End the lobbying industrial complex. That's how you restore competition, not by using the FTC sloppily as they've tried to do.
I think my question would be about plans to support families possibly through strategies like UBI that is maybe more sympathetic to low-income families that need additional support during these difficult times.
Well, I'm not for UBI, but I have a better form of this that channels some of those instincts in a productive direction. Shut down the Department of Education, give the $80 billion back to parents across this country, and then listen up, 80% of the time, maybe even more, when you switch your kids from a bad school to a better one, you're switching from a school that spends more money to one that spends less money. So in that case, I think a parent should be able to take for the kid half of that difference with them. So in New York City, let's do the math. $40,000 per student per year in a bad public school, less than $20,000 per student per year in a better performing charter school. Half that difference is $10,000 a year. Put it in that kid's account. When that kid graduates from high school, he'll have a $250,000 graduation gift if it's invested remotely properly. Tell me what's a better use of money, right? Teachers union, bureaucracies, and the Department of Education are that head start on the American dream. So I take a lot of those ideas that maybe may not be practical as applied, but apply them in a focused context. And look, I do think it's going to take somebody coming from the outside with fresh legs from the next generation. Somebody who's been a CEO in the White House to get this done, and I think I'm the only person in this race who can do that.
Thanks to Vivek Ramaswamy for joining us here at the iconic airport diner for Diner Table Economics, sponsored by the Competitiveness Coalition. Find out more at competitivenesscoalition.com.